Well, good morning. It is wonderful to be with you this morning. I'm so glad you're here. My name is Joey. I'm the pastor here. I'm excited to open up God's Word with you, but before we do, let's pray together. Father, this morning, as we just sang, I pray that we would come before you and behold your name. Father, I pray that we would experience you through your Spirit as you make yourself present in this room. I pray that we would experience you as we interact with each other and we see you in each other. And God, I pray as we open your word this morning that we would so clearly see who you are and who you desire for us to be. Father, help us to be good listeners and to see clearly who you are. In your name, amen. Before we get started this morning, TJ wanted me to share a quick announcement with you. The youth are planning a mission trip again this summer. And Christy, is it a surprise where we're going on this mission trip? It is not a surprise. All right, perfect. I have maybe accidentally spoiled that before, so I want to double check. They are going to West Virginia this summer, which is going to be really exciting. I don't know a lot about West Virginia. I think they have mountains and some other stuff that's really cool, but most importantly, they have people who really need to know about Jesus and need help with some different things in their community. So if you are interested in that, if you're an 8th through 12th grader, they're going to have that meeting this Wednesday night in the lounge, which is the room back in that corner with all the couches around. It's a fantastic space. So come and sit down and enjoy. If you're just curious about what they're doing and what's going on, come and join us for that meeting. Parents, you are welcome as well. All right. Well, this morning, oh man, how many of you are tired? Any tired people out there this morning? Yeah, we have a few tired people. I get that. Tiredness happens. And you know, it's funny. I think rest is something that many of us desire, but not always all of us desire in our lives. And so, you know, if I ask the question like, do you desire rest? The answer to that kind of just depends on like, what stage of life am I in, right? If you're an infant, like you need so much rest, but as soon as someone lays you down and it's your time, you're like, nope, not right now, right? That's not happening. Or if you're a toddler, you're like, no, running and screaming like, this isn't happening. No nap time, no nap time, no nap time, until you just crash, right? We all have just this different view of rest depending on what stage of life we're in. And in college, you're just, I don't know, it's like you just get this little window where sleep just doesn't matter. You can do whatever you want. You're almost invincible. High school, college age, you just have so much energy. You just sort of exchange sleep for just caffeine. Everything works out. But then eventually you get to the point where you're like, oh, sleep is the best. I wish I could have it. I remember when we had just been married and Caitlin was in school and I was working in a warehouse doing a really physical job, and there would be days where I'd come home and I didn't want to even make the effort to change out of my dirty work clothes, so I just slept right on the floor. I just laid down right on the floor in the living room. Caitlin would come home and find me like, what happened? Like, is he alive? Like, what's going on, right? And it's like, I just need rest. I crave it so much. I'm not even going to like take a shower and change my clothes. I'm just going to, right here. Here we go. I'm so tired. We all have this desire for rest that comes in our life, and sometimes more than others. But God knows we have this desire for rest, and that's what our passage is about today, is that God recognizes, He hears us, He sees us when we need rest, and He invites us into His rest. And His rest is a little bit different kind of rest than the rest we were just talking about right now. So we're going to unpack that together this morning. But first, I just want to acknowledge, so last week, we talked about this warning against unbelief. And this week is kind of part 2 to that. And so our author in Hebrews is using rest to help us kind of wrestle with our belief and our faith and engaging with God. And so this is kind of part 2. So we're going to go back and look a little bit at what we studied last week and how we looked at how God doesn't want us to turn away from Him. He doesn't want to allow our hearts to become hardened by sin. He encourages us to encourage one another so we can persevere in faith. And so we're going to go back and take a look at that too, but this is kind of our part 2. But I want to acknowledge something before we get into it, because the Bible at many times is very accessible. It's easy to understand. And I think it's fascinating because God makes the things that are most simple and the things that are most important to us easy to understand and to see in Scripture. Things like the gospel, understanding who Jesus is and who God is. You're maybe, many of you, familiar with this passage. Help. John 3:16. There it is. We did it. It says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life." This is very straightforward. We understand what the gospel is when we read this passage. It's easy to remember. We know it. The same thing is true, at least for me, when I go to Ephesians 2. It's one of my favorite places to understand the gospel. But because of his great love for us, God, who's rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ, even when we were dead in transgressions. It's by grace you've been saved. So I appreciate so much that God wrote his word and did it in such a way that we can clearly see the gospel, clearly understand who he is. But then there's these parts of the Bible that are not so easy to understand. And they're hard, and we have to dig a little deeper, but they still have great value for us. And today's passage is one of those. We're together, we're going to kind of journey through this and try to figure out, all right, what does the author of Hebrews mean when he says rest? Because he says it in a few different contexts, and it gets kind of confusing, and your head starts spinning. And so we want to kind of unpack this together. And I read it many, many times this week, and my head was spinning, so I'm going to try to help you have a little less head spinning, and we're going to journey through this together this morning. So if you want to follow along, inside your bulletin, we have a note sheet. If you like to take notes, the passage is also written in there, so you can go back and look at any time where we're at in the passage, and it'll be on the screen behind me as well. So let's go to Hebrews 4, 1-13. It says, there we go. "Therefore, since the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short of it." All right, we're going to stop right there because, of course, we have a therefore. So what is a therefore? I promise we're going to go back and take a couple notes. If you weren't here last week, there's just a couple things you need to know to understand our passage today. So what happened before this? Well, what we need to know is the author of Hebrews last week used this story of God's people, the Israelites from the Old Testament, being rescued out of Egypt, taken into the wilderness, and then invited to enter God's rest, which in that story was the promised land. So that promise happened, so God's people were led out, they were brought in, but the thing is, when God led them right up to it, they chose not to trust God and not to enter, so they had to spend 40 years in the wilderness, wandering around, waiting for Joshua to eventually lead them into the promised land. All right, those are the key things. That was so short. That's our catch-up. Which brings us to our big point today, which comes from this passage. If you want to know where are we going, what is this all about, it's right here in this first verse. "Therefore, since the promise of entering his rest still stands, let's be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short of it." That big idea is the promise of entering God's rest still stands. He presents it to us. He invites us into his rest today, tomorrow, and every single day that the passage is going to say that we call today. God is inviting us into his rest. We're going to see that this morning. And the author of Hebrews does not want us to miss this opportunity. So he's going to help us make this as clear as possible. So the two big questions as we tackle this idea of this promise of entering God's rest is, one, what is God's rest? We're going to explore that together today. But also, what guidance does this passage have for us for how do we enter in to God's rest? What is it? How do we have it? Very simple. All right, we're going to go forward together to verse 2. So now verse 2 through 10, this is where things get a little dicier. We're going to unpack this together. What is this saying? Verse 2 says, "For we also have had the good news proclaimed to us, just as they did, but the message they heard was of no value to them because they did not share the faith of those who obeyed." They did not share the faith of those who obeyed. So the author of Hebrews today is being very pastoral to us. I may refer to him as the author or the pastor of this book here this morning as he's trying to lead us and help us get into God's rest. But he's saying that we have heard the good news of Jesus. So he's speaking to this first century church and saying, you have heard the good news. And to us today too, we have heard that same good news. And it is very similar to the good news that was received by the ancient Israelites in the story I just told you about, where they were rescued out of Egypt and wandering in the wilderness. But the message, it says, was of no value to them. It was of no value to them because they did not obey. Because they did not obey. So consequently, they did not get to enter into God's rest. And he's saying we are at the same risk that they were. If we hear the good news of Jesus, but we do not obey, it's so important that we don't just hear, but then we hear and it changes us, and we obey and we follow. Hearing the message alone does not mean that we truly believe and understand. So how do we know if we believe? How do we know if our beliefs and our actions match up? That brings us to our first truth this morning that the pastor of Hebrews wants us to know, which is faith is made known through faithfulness. Faith is made known through faithfulness. What does that mean? Faithfulness is the actions in our lives, the things we do, the way we live day to day that actually shows what we truly believe. It's the evidence of the faith that exists inside of us. Our faith is made known through our faithfulness. When we truly understand something, when it gets ingrained into our minds, when we internalize that truth, eventually it gets to the point where it starts to shape us and change us and make us into something new. God uses His Word to make us more like Him, to draw us into Himself. Until we get to the point where we are new, we are different, and we actually act differently and act on His Word. And when we do that, we can see our faith being lived out in our lives. Tim Mackey, the co-founder of the Bible Project, pointed me and some of his teaching to a philosopher named Michael Novak, and he talks about 3 different kinds of faith, and I think this is so helpful in our understanding of this concept of faith is made known through faithfulness. He says, we have public beliefs, all right? We have public beliefs. These are the things that we say out loud, I believe this, right? You might say, whatever it is that you believe, I'm a fan of this team, I believe we should do this, do that, whatever. That's the thing we say with our mouth, with our words that we believe. But then he says, we also have these sort of private beliefs. What we think inside of our head, this is what I think I believe about our world or myself. But then we have core beliefs, which is how do I actually live my life? Because it's one thing to say something or to think it, but how am I actually living in my life? These are 3 different forms of belief. So I'm thinking about this week for myself, and I've caught myself many times saying the phrase, I think healthy living is much more about diet than exercise. This is a truth that I believe, that I've learned about, that I feel like it's important what we put into our bodies, and that we take care of ourselves in that way. And even in my mind, I think to myself, you know what? I eat pretty good. Like, I try to do as well as I can, eat some veggies, that kind of thing. How do I actually live? I had ribs last night with fries. It was fantastic. And I had coffee cake for lunch, which, if you don't know what it is, all you need to know is it has cake in the name. I haven't had a veggie since lunch on Friday, okay? My meals were delicious, they were great, and so I say out loud, it's so important what you put into your body, and in my mind I go, I think I do a pretty good job, and then I look back at what I ate, and I was like, I don't know, right? Does what we say and what we think and what we do actually line up? That's what the pastor, the author of Hebrews, is trying to get us to see this morning. Because for most of us, if we're being really honest, there's a gap between what I say, what I think, and what I actually do in my life. So the Israelites, going back to the story that he's referencing, they say they believe in God, but when they get up to the promised land and God just says, all you got to do is walk in, they're like, I don't feel good about that. I'm going to come back over here. So they say they believe in God, they say they trust Him, but then they don't enter in. So the author of Hebrews wants us to kind of find ourselves in this story of God's people so that we can see what God wants to teach us. It's an example that we can learn from. That's why he keeps going back all through Hebrews. We're going to go back to the Old Testament and see these examples that we can learn from. So the question we should ask ourselves is, do my statements of belief, my thoughts, actually line up with my actions? And I know food is kind of a silly example, but in more seriousness, many people have asked, hey, I heard you moved recently. Yes, we did. We're still in town. We haven't gone very far, but we moved to a different house, and we're thankful for it, and it's been good, and it's hard to move, packing up, loading. We had many, many good, helpful friends, but one of the eye-opening moments for me was I kind of like to think, I don't buy things I don't need, and, we live modestly and all these things, but when any person, but especially this is true for me, you put all your stuff in one pile, and you can see it all in one place, you're like, oh, I thought I wasn't buying things I don't need, but look at all the stuff we have, and all of a sudden you start to go, this feels like a lot, maybe we need to have a garage sale right now, right? It's already out on the driveway, just put a sign up, let's take care of it, it'll be easier to load the truck, right? It'll be great. So sometimes what we think in our head, when we actually see it presented in front of us, we go, maybe my internal thoughts are not lining up with how I'm living my life. But I think this is a grace. It's a grace that God gives us, where he reveals to us how we're actually living our life. He uses his word to make us ask this question, how am I actually living? God, what are you calling me to do? Does what you teach me and what I think about myself and what I proclaim actually match up with how I'm living? The Israelites, again, going back to the story, they saw God on display. They publicly worshiped him. They proclaimed his name. But when it came time to put their money where their mouth is, they did not walk in to the promised land. So we get this warning in verse 1. Therefore, since the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short of it. He does not want us to fall short of entering into the rest of God. If we say and proclaim that we worship God and we trust him, one of the ways that we can show that in the way that we live our lives is to enter into his rest. Okay, so what is his rest? Let's continue on in our story and see if we can understand this together. Verse 3. Now we who have believed enter that rest, just as God has said, so I declared on oath in my anger, they shall never enter my rest. Okay, the definition of rest in this verse can be seen a little bit more easily if we kind of track it back. So again, this line of, so I declared on oath in my anger, they shall never enter my rest, comes back from Psalm 95. It's quoting it. It's going back to that same story I just summarized for you that we looked at last week. It's that same quote. So we actually see multiple definitions of rest in here, and the one that comes from Psalm 95 is this understanding of walking into the promised land. So we actually see this idea of God's people being invited in to the promised land. So that's our first definition of rest, is that in this story, in the context, God says, come and enter my rest to his people. It's referenced in Psalms, it's referenced again by author, come into the promised land, this physical, geographical place. That's one definition, but then we get the rest of verse 3 into verse 4, and it says, and yet his works have been finished since the creation of the world, for somewhere he has spoken about the seventh day in these words. I love that. Somewhere he has spoken. Genesis, the very beginning, page 1. On the seventh day, God rested from all his works. And again in the passage above, he says, they shall never enter my rest. Rest is used many times in here. How should we understand this? It's interesting that God says, my rest. They shall never enter my rest. What does that mean? What is God's rest? Well, the author of Hebrews, the pastor of Hebrews says that we see in Genesis that God rested on the seventh day. And God made the world and all that's in it, and then afterward he entered into his rest. But the seventh day, if you go back and read that story, didn't end right there. It went from one day to the next day to the next day, but then the seventh day, and it did not have an end. The rest that God established at the conclusion of creation was around well before God's people entered the promised land and continues long after that story. And it's available to us today to partake in. So second kind of rest that we see here is this eternal rest. One that God either created or at least he entered into back at the beginning of the world. Now let's understand this more by going into verse 6 here. I'm unpacking a little bit more to get some clarity. It says, therefore, since it still remains for some to enter that rest, and since those who formerly had the good news proclaimed to them did not go in because of their disobedience, God again set a certain day, calling it today. This he did when a long time later he spoke through David, as in the passage already quoted, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken later about another day. What is going on there? That's a lot of lingo. He keeps going back to the Psalm 95 again and again and again and quoting it. Now, Psalm 95 was written hundreds of years later than the story of Joshua and God's people entering into the promised land, that first kind of rest. So he's talking about this different kind of rest that exists for us today. This kind of rest isn't tied to a location like the promised land, but it's this eternal rest that God established at the beginning of the world. To help us out here, I've got a quote from Donald Hagner and a helpful commentary. He says, the rest not entered by the Israelites refers not simply to literal rest in the land of Canaan, which is but a picture of something greater, but to a kind of transcendent spiritual rest enjoyed by God and offered to his people, who now in these last days have the privilege of entering it. This is a different kind of rest. There's the physical place of rest that God invites his people to in the story, but then there's this eternal spiritual rest that God invites us into today. And then there's a third kind, and we get to verse 9. It says, there remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For anyone who enters God's rest also rests from their works, just as God did from his. Okay, we're going to go back and recap the rests and how they work together. But first, let's understand this third one of Sabbath. What is the Sabbath rest that the author is speaking of? Because his listeners in the first century church would have a context and idea of what this Sabbath rest means. And that would come primarily from this passage in Exodus. It says, remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you will labor, do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in the 6 days the Lord made the heaven and the earth, the sea and all that was in them, but on the seventh day he rested. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. We see this idea, this picture of God setting this example for us in Scripture in the creation of the world, where he says, yes, I have made you in my image to do work, and you'll take joy in that work, and you'll work the land, but you need space and time to rest. You need to rest. This is the example I set for you, and a gift I have given to you, that you may rest. And then Jesus talks about it. In the New Testament, it says, then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, so the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. I include this one just to say it's so helpful that Jesus clarifies for us that the Sabbath is not an obligation. It's not this thing that God says, you have to do this to please me. He says, I gift this to you. The Sabbath was made for man. It's this thing I created for you because I know that you need rest. And I know depending on the stage of life you're in, you may not be desiring rest at the same rate, but I know that each and every one of us needs rest. And I want to gift that to you. I want to care for you. So I instruct you to take that rest. To take that rest. Now we could spend a lot of time talking about Sabbath, but I just want to mention a couple helpful things about it. And the first thing is, Sabbath rest requires trust in God. It is hard. I struggle with this myself. When you start out on your week and you look at your to-do list and everything that has to get done, you go, there's no way I have time to rest for a whole day. How's that going to happen, right? But God says, trust me. I am in control of everything. I care so deeply for you. I would not give you this gift of rest if I wasn't going to take care of all the things that you're worrying about aren't going to get done if you don't take that rest. It requires incredible trust for us to walk in to the Sabbath rest that God gifts to us. The second thing is it just gives us very practical physical rest. We all get tired. We all need sleep. I can tell when I haven't had sleep. It's harder to function. You know, maybe some Sundays you've been able to tell when I didn't get as much sleep, right? I come up and it's like, what words was he saying and in what order? I don't understand, right? We all need sleep to function well, to function in the way that God created us to live. But also, and this is one that gets so overlooked when we talk about Sabbath, the way we practice it in our life, is that God invites us into spiritual renewal in that time of Sabbath. He encourages us to come before and worship him, to spend time reconnecting with him and time in his word and time in fellowship with other believers so that we can be refreshed and renewed, not just physically, but spiritually. This is the gift of rest God has given us. And the last thing is, it gives us this taste, just this taste of the eternal rest that is to come. The joy, the physical rest, the trust in God, the spiritual renewal, all those things we experience in Sabbath are just a taste of this eternal rest that we've been talking about, that God invites us into. It just gives us a glimpse, just a shadow of what is to come. Hebrews is going to use that language a lot more later in later chapters. I like to think of Sabbath as the samples in the grocery store. Anyone remember that? I don't think they've done that in a long time. Anyone go to a grocery store that offered samples? They'd have like the microwave out in the middle of the store, and like the guy's cooking up the whatever thing, and they got the toothpicks, and you go by. And you know, you always see, you're like, oh, I was hungry. I shouldn't have gone to the store hungry, but at least there's a sample, right? And then you like put a hat on and you go back again. You're like, hi, like, nice to meet you. Can I have another one of those, right? Samples are amazing. And if you're a kid, you're like, can I have 4 of those? Because you just don't have any sense of what's appropriate. So you're just asking you to take. And usually they're like, oh, yeah, go ahead. That's cute, right? Samples are amazing, but they're just a taste. Like, they always cut them in such small, they make like a corn dog, they pull it out, and it's just these little tiny little bites. It's just a taste of what's going to come. But it does help get you through, and it gives you just a view of what is coming next, right? Until you can get home, until you can make a proper meal. So until we go home, until we're with God, until we can fully experience the rest that he promises, Sabbath is this taste of what is to come. And he invites us into it. He gives it to us as a gift. So our second truth this morning is that Sabbath rest produces trust and anticipation. Sabbath rest produces trust and anticipation. When we trust God enough to practice Sabbath, it builds our trust in him because we see that he cared for us even though we took that time to rest. And it builds anticipation as we enjoy that time of rest and fellowship and spiritual renewal that we know one day is going to be how we spend all of our time in the presence of the Lord. Sabbath rest produces trust and anticipation. Now, I mentioned it's the third kind of rest in our passage. So how do we put this all together and make it make sense so our head isn't spinning on what this passage is trying to tell us? Like I mentioned, I read through so many times. I read more commentaries than I normally do to try to understand what is going on in this passage, and I came to two conclusions. And the first is that I don't think the author, the pastor of Hebrews, is being really clear for us on what he means by rest, and I think there's a reason for it, and we're going to get to that in a second. But the second conclusion is that I think there are clearly these three different kinds of rest, and the first one is that promised land. That promised land that he goes back and he talks about this physical space, which sometimes he's talking about rest, he's referring back to the story because he wants us to learn from the mistakes of our ancestors in the past. He wants to take this example and say, this is what happened, this is how God responded to them, and in the same way, God will react and respond to you when he invites you into rest. The second kind of rest is the Sabbath rest that we were just talking about. This gift given to us by God, this privilege that we get to enter into so we can get a taste of what is to come, which is the third rest, which is an eternal rest. This is the ultimate rest. The rest that we get to experience when God comes back and calls his people to himself and returns the world to its original glory. That is an amazing thought. We're not going to go into that. But I love this picture that God's going to come back and restore everything, and in that we're going to find a rest that we've only been able to taste and sample up until that point. This is the rest that is reserved for those who have persevered in faith, as he talked about in the last couple of weeks. This is the rest created for those whose actions affirm their faith, who the way we live our life lines up with what we believe and know about God. Despite some of the confusion and all this, I think the author, again, I led this up because I think he's being really pastoral to us here. I think he's trying to instruct us about our relationship with God and warn us about unbelief. He wants us, as we listen to this story, as we come to this passage, to identify with a form of rest that we need depending on where we're at in our faith. You may need to begin your faith journey. Right now, maybe you haven't started it yet. Maybe you need to start by confessing your faith and entering into the rest of just trusting Jesus as your Savior. He uses this story and the story of the wilderness and the promised land to show us what happens if you don't trust in the rest of God, if you don't trust enough to enter in. Right? We go back to last week in Hebrews 3:12, and it says, "See to it, brothers and sisters, that none of you has a sinful, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God." He wants you to be invited in. And then this week, since the promise of entering his rest is still available, let us be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short. He wants it to be so clear to us that God invites us to know him, to follow him, to trust him, and we don't want to fall short of that. We don't want to not be able to enter into his rest. But maybe this morning, you've already chosen to follow Jesus and to trust him, and what you need to hear is that God gives us this gift of Sabbath rest, that we can set aside the stresses and the worries of our day and our world. We can come before God and say, God, I trust you. I'm going to accept this gift of rest today. I'm going to take a nap. I'm going to open up your word. I'm going to spend some time in prayer. I'm going to eat something tasty. I'm going to rest today. He uses the spiritual discipline, this gift of Sabbath, to help us see that we can affirm our faith through action. When we take the Sabbath rest, we are saying, I trust God enough that he is my God, that he is my Savior, that I can take this time to rest and to Sabbath. Which goes back to our verse 2, right? For we also have had the good news proclaimed to us just as they did. But the message they heard was of no value because they didn't obey. Faith without obedience questions the sincerity of our faith. So now we get to our application this morning, which is led to us right here by our author. He takes us right into verse 11 and he says, I've told you all of this that you need to know about rest. Let us therefore, obviously, make every effort to enter that rest so that no one will perish by following their example of disobedience. The consequence of not entering the rest is that we will perish. God invites us in. His rest still stands. It's still available to us. So he says, why should we not walk right in and accept this gift of rest that God has given us? So I want to give you a couple things to chew on and think about as you go about your week. The first one is, what do your actions reveal about your faith? This is not a time for guilt or shame. When we come to God's word and it shows us, reveals to us that the way we're living our life does not match up with what we believe about God or what his word, more importantly, what his word says about God, this is an opportunity for us to course correct. God brings us back in by bringing hard truths to our attention. Examine your life. Invite others into that process of examining your life and ask yourself, what do my actions reveal about my faith? Does it reveal that I trust God? Does it reveal that I'm following him, or does it reveal something else entirely? The second thing is, are you trusting God by receiving the gift of Sabbath in anticipation of the eternal rest that awaits us? I don't know about you, but there are several days in the last year, in my lifetime, whatever time frame you want to pick, where I just feel like, God, I'm so ready for you to come to heal this place, to heal this world, to make everything right. And God says, I hear you, I see your plight, and I have a plan for that. But in the meantime, I give you this gift of my rest that you can enjoy. You can have a sample, a taste, to be reminded regularly the promise I have made that you will get to one day enter my rest and everything will be made whole. God does not leave us waiting and wondering what's going to happen. He comes alongside and cares for us even in the journey, even while we're waiting for the eternal rest that is to come. So thankful for a God that does that. And then lastly, the author of Hebrews just straightforward pastors us in these last couple of verses. When we come to conclusion, he says, for the word of God is alive and active, sharper than any double-edged sword. It penetrates even to dividing soul and spirit, joints and marrow. It judges the thoughts and attitudes of the heart. Nothing in all creation is hidden from God's sight. Everything is uncovered and laid bare before the eyes of him to whom we must give account. He presents this whole story, this whole teaching, and then he comes to the end and he says, don't take my word for it. The word of God is what is alive and active in your heart and in your life. It's sharper than any double-edged sword. I appreciate that imagery. I think of, have you ever had a knife that is really sharp? A couple years ago, someone taught me how to sharpen our knives, and I didn't know we had dull knives. But then I'm cutting some cheese, and it's just like, whoa, it went right through, and I didn't even notice it had cut my finger until I saw the blood on the counter because the knife was so sharp it made such a clean cut. This is the kind of knife that we're talking about here. Sharper than any double-edged sword, it penetrates so deeply. God's word comes in to our lives and goes straight to the soul, straight to the heart to change us, to penetrate us, to impact us. Nothing in creation is hidden from God's sight. He sees everything that we do, everything that we think. Everything is uncovered and laid bare before the eyes of him to whom we must give account. When we read God's word, when we listen really closely, when we truly consider what it's saying to us, it will open us up and expose our hearts, expose the reality that we're living in, and expose to us who God really is, so we can see him, understand him, be convicted, and be drawn back into him. God's word is active and alive. It's this amazing tool that we get to use to be made aware of our condition. I want to close by sharing a little bit longer quote from N.T. Wright that helps us see this so clearly, the value of God's word and what it does in our hearts and our lives. He says this, "So what is it exactly that God's word is supposed to do, and how can we respond to its challenge? Well, part of the point of verses 12 and 13 is that it's going to do its work and you can't escape, but clearly a lot of people do escape, for the moment at least, presumably either by staying out of earshot, whether it's not opening the Bible or listening to a sermon, or just firmly ignoring anything they do hear. But part of what this passage seems to be saying is that you can't escape in the end. That if you imagine you can slide along in unbelief and slip by unnoticed into the rest that God has promised his faithful people, God's word will find you out, will pierce through, disclose what's really going on, the secret thoughts, the plans, the intentions that you make the real center of your life. Everyone must sooner or later give an account of themselves. And at that moment, if never before, all will be revealed. God patiently waits for us. And in the meantime, he wants us to see who he really is and who we really are before it's too late, because there will come a time. It says, at that moment, if never before, we will all be revealed. At some point in time, it will be revealed what we really believe and who we really are. And God says, I don't want you to wait until it's too late. I want you to enter my rest now. Allow my word to come in and work in your life in such a way that you see who I am and you understand and you turn back towards me. Don't miss this opportunity to enter my rest. God's word is an expression of grace in our lives, an expression of his deep and profound love for us. And the promise of entering his rest still stands. Be careful that you're not found to be falling short of entering it. Let's pray. God, your grace and your love are known all across the world. You make it so clear to us how deeply you love us and how much your grace overflows no matter who we are and what we've done. God, I pray that we would listen closely to your word and to the people that you place in our life to help us be pointed back to you. I pray that we would receive your instruction and your conviction as grace and love and not as something to bring shame into our lives. God, help us to turn back to you, to not wait too long, to trust in the rest that you offer. And when you lead us up to the door of your rest, Lord, help us to walk right in. Take away our doubts. Take away our fear. Help us to trust you in all things. Use your word to instruct us and to draw us into yourself in a powerful way. In your name, amen.